author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The Department of Homeland Security paying non-governmental organizations to claim Republicans are terrorists. The debt negotiations in full swing, and Twitter comes into its own. All this and more on today's edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to wish a fond hello to our listeners out in Chester Springs, Philadelphia on WFYL 1180 AM. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Negotiations between President Joe Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy seem set to raise the national debt from $31.4 trillion to somewhere around the $35 trillion mark. Now, what does that mean for the nation? What does it mean in terms of the interest payments, most importantly? Well, to figure all this out, we're joined by Mr. Andrew Moran, economics correspondent and editor at LibertyNation.com. Andrew, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, let's discuss what the cuts were that were made in the proposed deal there. And so I believe it was $50 billion. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's about $50 billion in cuts. This includes about $30 billion that's gone from COVID-19 related spending, and then the other $20 billion over 2 years from the new IRS funding. And the rest are just spending caps for the next 2 years, and then they're gone after 2026. And then some of it's energy permitting reform, although that is bogus too if you dive deeper into the legislation. So overall, this bill pretty much it angers a lot of fiscal conservatives.
You know, I think the key thing that nobody except you on the pages of LibertyNation.com really point this out is that the amount of cuts that the Republicans who are in favor of this particular deal are celebrating will be eaten up in interest payments for the newly borrowed money anyway, won't it?
Exactly. So let's look at some of the numbers here. So if you look at Biden's 2024 budget proposal, he proposes spending $82 trillion over the next 10 years. If you look at the latest Congressional Budget Office report, it says that the Republican proposal to cap spending will reduce that spending by $1.5 trillion over that same time span. Now, when we talk about interest payments, again, the White House proposal says interest payments will be about $3.1 trillion over the next 10 years. You look at the CBO report again, it says that this Fiscal Responsibility Act will reduce interest payments by $188 billion. So you have astronomical numbers, and then the Republican leadership will go into it and say, this is a great deal for America. It's worthy of the American people. How can anyone say that with a straight face when you look at the long-term spending projections from the Republicans, from the White House, and the CBO?
Now, let's put this into really, really simple terms that even I can understand. Does this mean, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that the $50 billion that's being lauded as savings by some Republicans, that essentially is less than the new amount of interest that will be paid on the new money that's being borrowed?
Yeah, exactly. So if the latest CBO report, not the one that came out a couple of months ago, it says that total interest payments will be about $600 billion this year. So $50 billion with $600 billion interest payments, this is nothing. I wrote in my article recently that will not even cover 2 months worth of interest payments, this $50 billion in savings that the Republicans are touting for this year and next year. So overall, it's hard to fathom how that's going to do anything for interest payments, especially when you consider that interest alone is now one of the biggest budget items every single year in this rising rate environment. It's going to be about $1 trillion a year by at least 2030. So yeah, interest payments are keep going up, and there's no way that anything is going to be done to mitigate that because no one's willing to take a chainsaw, not, as I said in my article, eyebrow scissors to cut the budget.
So there's a couple of questions I need to follow up on regarding the interest here. Now, I see on television, on the rare occasions I watch, I always see these adverts for use our debt restructuring company to help you limit your repayments. why isn't the US government doing something similar, looking at a way to restructure their debt? Because to me, it seems as though you're reaching a point where all receipts that come in will be equal to the amount that has to go out in just debt payment, which doesn't cover all the things that are I guess they're called non-discretionary, which means the things that have to be paid year on year.
Yeah, the mandatory spending. I mean, that counts for 2/3 of the budget, and nobody touches. But to your broader question about debt restructuring, the thing is that there is such a demand for U.S. government bonds that there's no need to restructure any debt. I mean, the U.S. is in Greece for now. There's not going to be a sovereign debt crisis occurring. That these debt restructuring things that happen on a national scale, that only happens when you become a country like Greece, and that requires the IMF to intervene or the World Bank to intervene or all these massive international organizations.
Yeah, in Greece and Italy, where that happened, where the EU appointed a new country's leader, courtesy of the IMF.
Yeah, exactly. So no one's gonna oust Joe Biden or the next Republican nominee over.
I would suggest that if the IMF were going to oust America's leader and then put a puppet in control there, I'd suggest that they would just hire Joe Biden back again, wouldn't they? Or is that's maybe just my opinion on that? Now, the second question I had about this: so America's going to be borrowing this extra $4 trillion over the period of a couple of years. Now, who are they borrowing that from?
So what they're doing, they go to the capital markets. They sell treasury bonds. They sell it to individual investors. They sell it to institutions. They sell it to foreign investors, foreign governments. You and I talked off air about foreign demand for treasury bonds. You look at the latest treasury numbers, and it shows that all these foreign governments are scooping up government bonds. However, at the same time, the demand has actually lowered over the past year. So China used to be the largest holder of U.S. government debt. It's become number 2 because its holdings of U.S. Treasury debt has fallen about 20% over the past year to around $860 billion.
Who's number 1 now?
Japan, also Japan, though, over the past year, it's been on a downward trend of buying U.S. government debt, except from December to January. But overall, all foreign holdings of Treasury securities have been on a decline over the past year, from about 4.3 to $3.8 trillion.
So, Andrew, are you telling me that the American taxpayer is going to be on the hook for the next decade to paying back money to China?
Well, next decade, I mean, you look at the numbers, and it's going to be future generations covering all this debt because nobody's slowing down whatsoever. The government taxes, borrows, and inflates. And that is the mantra of Washington today, and perpetual can kicking.
Rinse, cycle, debt, repeat, as the title of your article told us today, Andrew. Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio right here on the Radio America Network. Now, later in the show, we have special guest Brent Bozell of the Media Research Center here to talk about a special report conducted by the Media Research Center into the DHS targeting conservatives and Christians across America. Now, that's some heady stuff, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short break talking liberty with Scott D. Cosenza discussing the latest Twitter debacles for the Democrats. Now, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Representative Adam Schiff achieved something that very few human beings have achieved on this earth, and that is to become a 100% ratio on the pages of Twitter. Now, for those of you who don't know what that means, or even what Mr. Schiff did to deserve this rather dubious honor, we're joined by host of the Uprising podcast, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, general man about town, and possessor of the proud Twitter handle at Uprising Podcast on Twitter, Scott D. Cosenza. Thanks for being here, Scott.
Who hasn't been ratioed yet, I believe. Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure.
Let's no, not yet, but the day's still early. The
thing about being ratioed is you have to have a lot of attention. So in the game of social media, you have to start by winning before you can lose big through a ratio, right?
So a ratio, for our listeners who aren't familiar with this, it's when you tweet something and the responses are more negative than positive. So this people say he got ratioed if there were more negative responses than positive. In the case of Mr. Schiff's latest tweet, or sorry, May 31st tweet, it was actually 100% negative responses. So it's a very rare honor or dishonor indeed. Now, this is why I actually want to speak to Scott Cosenza about this, because there's actually a First Amendment free speech element that I believe Mr. Schiff completely ignored in his tweet. Now, I'll just read this to you, Scott. He says, "I am deeply distressed by the burning of the pride flag at a San Fernando Valley elementary school. Every child deserves safety and acceptance. We must fight against discrimination and create an inclusive environment for all. Hate has no place in our schools and communities." End quote. So, a couple of things to unpack there, Scott. What do you reckon?
Well, yeah, there is a free speech implication with burning a flag, to be sure. I think the key focus there, actually, in terms of law enforcement resources and how that might play out, is if the burning of any flag is used as an effort to intimidate someone illegally, then that act is illegal. If the burning of a flag is used to express speech, like to say these ideas or
speech
set of
here,
ideas,
we also mean opinion and personal feeling, right?
We are talking about the expression of ideas. That's exactly right. That is what speech means within the context of our First Amendment guarantees for free speech. And the Supreme Court has ruled in the case of the burning of the American flag, for instance, that they can't criminalize that activity because of its expressive nature, that people are doing it to express themselves, and that expression is covered under the First Amendment. Presumably, the burning of a pride flag would be covered by the same protections. Again, that's if the burning is designed to express a message and not for the purpose of intimidating. If there's like one trans kid at the school and they burn the flag on that person's lawn, that's not about the free speech necessarily, right? That's about something else.
Okay, so from what it seems here is, let's ignore that for some reason they have a range of flags at an elementary school. But he's saying that hate has no place in our communities. And Adam Schiff is referring to the hate as the burning of the flag, right? So that he's referring to the hate as an expression of a First Amendment right is hateful and has no place in our communities. I happen to know that many prominent Democrats have never said that burning the American flag is tantamount to hate and has no place in our communities. So where does the juxtaposition come in on this, Scott?
How dare you, Mark, to try to apply consistency and to punish hypocrisy in our elected officials? You'll be left without anybody. You'll be left without anybody to represent the American people in our halls of power.
I'll just make a Mark Angelides Liberty Nation Radio flag and let people burn it in an expression of their opinion, right? That's okay.
Yeah, one guesses that, especially with respect to the tweeter in question, Mr. Schiff, who has evidenced a remarkable capacity for thinking one thing when facts are on one side of the issue and then another thing when they're on the other side of the issue.
I believe you're referring to the irrefutable proof that he claims to have seen regarding Russian collusion.
He's not going to let your fetish for consistency and clear thinking color his opinion on this matter, I think.
Okay, so what we're putting this down to, this epic historical ratioing of Mr. Adam Schiff, is basically people just didn't enjoy the hypocrisy of it. But Twitter itself, it's quite the battleground now, isn't it, for both the expression of opinion and for the rehabilitation of certain characters, isn't it, Scott? And I think you know what I'm talking about here.
Let me know explicitly. What are you talking about?
Miss Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yes. Excuse me. It is. Well, it is a great place for that. So if you are, Kamala Harris has been, whether you agree that it's an accurate assessment or not, she's been assessed by many as being a person who lacks the ability to speak clearly and extemporaneously in a way that befits national leadership, I think, is the charitable way to say it.
Although I must interrupt, one of the View hosts, I don't know which one's name because they all seem quite interchangeable to me, mentioned that, well, she repeats the same thing again because she's a lawyer.
Well, the manner in which she does so, I think, maybe is indicative of her.
She's a
of her-
lawyer in the second
of her
grade.
legal career. Yeah, I'll just stop there before I get into some more trouble. But if you look at the the official VP Twitter feed and her Twitter feed, you can basically see, well, this is what the points that they think they need to work on, that they're responding to, by presenting her as the opposite of somebody who has trouble with words. So we'll see if that bears out when it comes time for people to cast their ballots.
All right, let's swing back to the free speech issue here. Now, obviously, Elon Musk, when he took over, he made some claims that he was a free speech absolutionist, I think were his exact words. And I know that for you and I, who both appreciate the value of free speech, that those were quite heady words to hear from somebody who's going to be controlling essentially the public town square, as it were.
Free speech absolutist. That's right.
Yeah. Now, do you think he's lived up to that promise?
Well, I don't think he ever said that Twitter would equal a total, free speech zone. He said that up to and including the law. Right. But there are certain things that he's shown a willingness to restrict speech in certain areas, especially with parody accounts. For instance, he's clamped down on that quite a bit. And so it's not the equal to the free speech protections we have guaranteed by the Constitution. However, I still think that Elon is the beacon of light and hope for public expression on these mega platforms. And mega platforms is where so many of us choose to engage other people. We're not by and large on alternatives to these platforms. When you look at the numbers, people favor these huge platforms. So to the extent that we have a huge platform, one of the most successful, and that the proprietor of that platform is committed to allowing different voices to speak, I think that that is all to the plus and to the good. And I celebrate the man's actions to make that happen. It was no small thing to buy Twitter, take it private, and dial back the massive censorship that the progressives, who worked at Twitter, were able to achieve for voices against those, ideas they didn't like.
And you can check out Scott D. Cosenza's ideas and his productions of the Uprising podcast at Podcast Uprising on Twitter, or check it out on libertynation.com or anywhere where good podcasts are provided. Scott, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
And you're listening to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. Now, after this short break, we're going to be back with Brent Bozell, founder and president of the Media Research Center. The MRC has carried out an in-depth study into the Department of Homeland Security's grantee program, which apparently targets conservatives and Christians across the country. It's going to be quite the show, quite the interview, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
A study by the Media Research Center exposes that the Department of Homeland Security has been handing out taxpayer cash to NGOs with a singular determination: to take down conservative organizations or to conflate people not on the political left with extremism. Now, we're very fortunate to have with us the founder and president of the Media Research Center, Mr. Brent Bozell, to discuss the details. Thanks for being here, Brent.
Thank you, Mark, for having me.
So my first question has to be, who is being targeted in this? And I guess what we'd call is, who's being targeted by this counter-terrorism program?
Mark, it's a stunning proposition. This was a program that was put together by Barack Obama during his years in the presidency. And it was meant to target domestic terrorism. There were Republicans and conservatives who opposed this because they said someday it would be turned against Republicans and conservatives. And because of that, Donald Trump ended the program. It came alive again at the end of his administration and now has been put on steroids by the Biden administration. And it is doing exactly what Republicans and conservatives feared. The DHS has been involved in one scandalous political activity after the next. We wanted to look at some of these grants that were being given out. Everybody has been FOIAing, doing Freedom of Information Acts, which you do in the United States, to the Department of Homeland Security to get documents from them. Well, they just simply refuse to comply, which is how this administration is working these days. That's how dictatorships work, by the way. And so we went to the grant recipients that have to answer as federal entities or recipients of federal aid and have to respond to a FOIA. We've done FOIAs on 40 of the 80 recipients. And by the way, it's $40 million that we're talking about here. And we're starting to get responses. But the response we received from the University of Dayton in Ohio is just stunning. They held a conference in December of 2021, which conference was supported by DHS and which conference was packaged at the end and sent to DHS with a grant request for future endeavors, and which granted it a $500,000 reward. This conference had a number of speakers, one who was a equated Ron DeSantis presidential candidate to the Holocaust, one who equated Donald Trump to Nazis. But the best one was this Mike Lodenthal. Mike Lodenthal presented a pyramid of right-wing extremist domestic terrorist organizations, and showing the pyramid of how it begins and how it grows and gets more and more extreme. And he has organizations placed on it. Mark, the names that are on here will blow you away. On the first level, he has got Fox News. He has got the Heritage Foundation, the most prestigious conservative foundation in America. He has the American Conservative Union, which holds CPACs all over the country. He has Fox News and Christian Broadcasting News, CBN, and then the Republican National Committee. So
RNC,
already on this domestic hate group, you've got the half of America is on level one. Then it goes to level two, which is more extremist than level one. Here he has the Tea Party Patriots. He has Turning Point USA, which is a massive youth organization, Breitbart News, the NRA, and Prager University. And then on the third level, he's got pro-Nazi organizations, and on the top level, Nazi organizations. And so this guy shows how you've got the progression of conservative equals Nazi equals domestic terrorists. Not even that was enough. In his speech, he suggested that they wanted to, quote, deny people, to shut down their websites, to close their meetings, and to physically prevent them from assembling in public. Now, Mark, what does the phrase physically prevent from assembling in public mean to you?
Well, that would be against Article 1 of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, wouldn't it?
Well, yeah, it's also it's a call for violence.
Yeah.
It's a call for violence.
Yeah.
There's no two ways around it. When you are physically preventing, you are committing an act of violence, which, by the way, is what's happening all over the country on college campuses. You're seeing it. And this guy who is, but it gets better than this. He said in this conference, he said, and I'm quoting here, a lot of things we're doing are illegal. A lot of it involves breaking the law. And so who is Mike Lodenthal? Well, wouldn't you know it? He's a member of Antifa.
Of course.
And the final little irony in this little story, he's also a supporter of the Earth Liberation Front, ELF. What is ELF? ELF has been deemed, I can't make this stuff up, by the FBI a domestic terrorist organization.
You're telling me this. I'm just thinking Saul Alinsky, turn it around on, and that's what they're doing, right?
It absolutely is. I mean, it is physically prevent conservatives from speaking out loud. And the DHS turned around and awarded them a grant of $500,000. Think about that.
It is shocking. You've got,
and that's only one. That's only one. We're getting more FOIAs, and there's going to be more stuff like this. But this is, Mark, this is the state of the United States government. It is a frightening proposition. No one ever thought we'd get to this. I really asked myself, what's the difference between this and the Stasi in East Germany? Now, what's the difference between this and the Soviet Union that has political prisoners? This is what they're doing. They're creating political prisoners right here. If you don't agree with them, you are a Nazi. And Nazis go to prison.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio on the Radio American Network. Just after this short break, we'll be back with Brent Bozell of the Media Research Center. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio talking with Brent Bozell, founder and president of the Media Research Center. These NGOs, they're putting out there, they're not putting out the information to the general public. It's being presented in reports to the DHS, as you say, and among like-minded associations. And you had to get that information via freedom of request, freedom of information requests. But what this does, it allows let's be fair, a hugely left-leaning media and politicians to say with a straight face that, for example, just a hypothetical quote here, the Heritage Foundation, which has been closely linked with international terrorism and Nazi organizations, etc., etc. It allows them to do that because it's then on documents that have been provided to the Department of Homeland Security. It's all about planting seeds, isn't it?
Really is, and it's also look. If these were virtuous grants that were given and justifiable, then both the grantor and the grantee would proudly have it in front of the world what they were doing, would they not? And why is it that neither the grantor nor the grantee will come forward and say what the money's, which doesn't belong to them, which belongs to the American taxpayer? Why is it that they feel compelled to give the middle finger to those people whose money they took to do this? Why do they do it? Because they can. Look, this is the same Mayorkas running the DHS who testifies under oath in the United States Congress and says the borders are secure. Don't believe your lying eyes. Millions are pouring across the borders. There's no security. I met with, over the weekend, I met with Ken Cuccinelli, who was the number 2 at the Department of Homeland Security under Donald Trump. And I told him that I'd read a report about how the American border was no longer controlled by the United States. In fact, the border is now controlled by the cartels in Mexico. And which sounds a little hyperbolic. I asked him, and he said, no, that's absolutely true. We've lost control. The cartels now control the American border, the border of the United States. That's how serious it's become. And Mayorkas, the head of the DHS, looks America in the eye and says, everything's secure. Fentanyl is pouring over by the hundreds of millions of dollars. You look at the streets of the United States, go to any city. Mark, it's such a pitiful sight to see the human living corpses on the street from fentanyl, the drug, how it's destroying the inner cities. It's coming from across the border from a man who says the borders are secure. When you can do that, then these grants, this is tiddlywinks to them.
Well, let's talk about those funds. So it's allocated, the funds are being allocated essentially to either look into where domestic terrorism exists or to root it out if it's in hiding. But it's being used, as you say, to conflate the RNC, Fox News, and other such organizations directly with Nazi groups. Now, it seems to me that by outsourcing this to NGOs to then give reports back to the DHS, it's essentially a Democrat administration going after its political enemies with a layer of plausible deniability. Does that make any sense?
Oh yeah. Don't look. It's not me saying it. It's not DHS saying it. This is University of Dayton that's saying this, not us. And by the way, that's exactly what DHS said when we came out with these documents. They said it's not us. We didn't do it. They did it. It's not us. And it happened before us. Never mind that they spoke at it. Never mind that this was sent to them as a justification for a grant. And it was because, and they also said we knew nothing about it, yet they had all the documents, and it was based on those documents that they rewarded the University of Dayton. They lied, but they just point to the University of Dayton, and they say, look at them. And by the way, something else, Mark, if they cared about domestic violence and this domestic terrorism, again, going to the border, would they not be focused like a laser on all the reports of Iranians, Chinese, other Middle Easterners pouring illegally into going across the southern border of the United States, just walking in? Would they not be more concerned about documented terrorists that have been coming into this country? Documented terrorists coming in. If you cared about domestic terrorists, they don't. What they care about is conservatives.
Yeah, well, it's the wrong kind of terrorist, Brent. You know, it's not the one that pushes their agenda forward. Now, well, what's the remedy here? I mean, how does this kind of, I don't know, I guess we'd call it egregious covert warfare. How does it get stopped?
Well, I think there are a number of things that you have to look at. You have to look at, number one, you have to look at the size of the American government today. It is utterly unaccountable. You cannot account for $4 trillion. It just simply cannot be done. Witness $1 trillion with the pandemic. Nobody knows where the money went. There are all these reports about how there were armed gangs of online thieves stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from nobody knows. So if you can't follow $1 trillion, you can't follow $4 trillion times 4. So people can do this kind of stuff and just hide it in these bills, i.e. what in the Department of Homeland Security, I don't know what their total budget is, but I can guarantee you this, $40 million is a drop in the bucket. So out $40 million goes. It means a lot of money to you and me, but out it goes. That's point number one. Point number two, having real policies in place to prevent this kind of thing, where there is criminal prosecution for those who do engage in this. And there are no rules against it right now. You get a slap in the wrist. The director of the FBI going into the Oval Office, I still can't get over this, Mark, going on with a listening device to try to snare the President of the United States using a hidden camera. That when the FBI is so weaponized, doing it simply for political reasons, this whole Russia hoax thing. Do you know, Mark, no one's been held to account for this? We now know unequivocally that this was a plot from the Hillary Clinton campaign using the FBI and the Justice Department to A, attempt to prevent Donald Trump from becoming president, and B, to remove him from the presidency. And no one has been held to account. This is why
there was one lawyer, but it was, Mr. Kleinsmith, got a slap on the wrist for some procedural violation. But besides that, you're right. Nobody's been held account for.
That's like saying you rob $1 million from a bank and you get a 1-1 sentence. You know. Okay,
yeah. I mean, that's follow Brent Bazell for more financial advice.
Yeah, well, I once had somebody embezzle about $500,000 from me, and he got a 4-month sentence, and it got me to thinking, do
that every year. Every year, that's a few $1 million there for you. So, Brent, let's talk a little bit generally about the media. Now, you are really at the forefront of the pushback against what is happening in the media, and the media are complicit in by what they omit, by what the legacy media, as we call it, I guess, by what they admit. They don't tell you about these things that you've uncovered. They do their best to poo-poo these things or downplay them or offer the DHS's response, which is, well, that was University of Dayton, Ohio. That wasn't us, even though we paid them $500,000 for it. So with the Media Research Center, could you perhaps tell our listeners like how they can follow your work there and what the mission provocator is, as it were?
Okay, so the mission, when the MRC began in 1987, we were committed to the proposition that unless conservatives did something about the bias of the liberal media, we would never be able to get our message across correctly. Now, that was then. Where are we now? We are now where I am ruining the good old days of liberal media bias, because where we are today is a place where I simply, and no one expected we could go. It's the same direction that liberalism has gone in this country. Liberalism doesn't exist anymore. It is far leftism. It's neo-Marxism that's at play. And it is true that the media truly are the tip of the spear of that. Witness the fact that if you didn't have their propaganda out there, it could never succeed. They succeed because of the propaganda. But the bias mark that's taking place is changed as well. The bias we dealt with 20 years ago, 10 years ago, was the bias by commission, where the media were distorting things to fit the liberal narrative. Now, the bias is far more dangerous. It's the bias by omission, where they simply don't tell the truth. They don't even report the news. And I'll give you an example, and the best example we can give. After the elections that were just completed, we did a national survey, and we asked the public, Biden's voters in the swing states of Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Biden took all those states except for North Carolina. We asked them a series of questions. One question was, and we asked Biden voters if they knew about this, if they didn't know about it, had they known, would they have voted for Biden? On all 5 state numbers of questions, the numbers were dramatic. But here's the best one. We asked them if they knew about the Hunter Biden laptop. Well, of course they did. Everybody knew about this. 49.4% of the Democrats who went to the polls in 2020 had never heard of Hunter Biden. Let me repeat that. Almost 50% had never heard of Hunter Biden or the laptop. So we then asked, if you had known about Hunter Biden and the laptop, would you have voted for Joe Biden? 9.4% of Biden's voters said they would not have. We took those 9.4 and we put it across those 7 states, the battleground states. Donald Trump would have won Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. Would have won every single one.
That's well over 100 electoral college points.
It would have won at least 317 electoral votes, an absolute landslide, if the media had simply reported the news. That's how powerful they are.
And that is the mission of Media Research Center, whose president and founder, Mr. Brent Bozell, has been kind enough to join us today. Brent, thanks ever so much for being with us.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. Thanks to our guests, Brent Bozell of Media Research Center, Scott DeCosenta, and Andrew Moran. And most of all, thanks to you at home for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone, hosted by Liberty Nation's
I'm
Lisa K. Donner, joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors, deconstructing leftist narratives, debating the hot topics, and remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative Five.